The beginning of 1943, after the victory at Stalingrad, the Red Army managed to seize the strategic initiative. While the remnants of the 6th Army of the Wehrmacht, surrounded at Stalingrad, were still resisting, the Red Army, taking advantage of the favorable situation, launched a counteroffensive. On January 13, the Ostrogosk-Rossosh offensive operation began, and on January 24, the forces of the Red Army began the Voronezh-Kostromnoye offensive operation. Both offensive operations developed quite successfully for the Red Army, thanks to which, at the beginning of February 1943, it succeeded in inflicting a number of defeats on the enemy to liberate Voronezh, Belgorod and Kursk, and also to capture more than 150,000 prisoners. The Red Army continued its offensive towards Kharkov and Rostov-on-Don. Under the onslaught of the Red Army, the Wehrmacht divisions retreated. Already on February 15, divisions of the Red Army reached the outskirts of Kharkov and began to storm the city. Under the threat of encirclement, despite the categorical prohibition of Hitler, the German divisions began to hastily leave Kharkov. On February 17, the Wehrmacht forces left Rostov-on-Don and took up defensive positions east of Taganrog along the banks of the Meuse River. At first glance, everything turned out to be as favorable as possible for the Red Army, but this was not entirely true. The Soviet command mistakenly decided that the Wehrmacht forces were exhausted and sought to reach the banks of the Dnieper as quickly as possible. The rapidly advancing divisions of the Red Army broke away from the main supply bases, which made it impossible to ensure the timely supply of ammunition. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht command managed to gather enough forces to launch a counteroffensive in the Kharkov region. It should be mentioned that the counteroffensive of the Wehrmacht came as a complete surprise to the Soviet command, and therefore the Red Army had to hastily organize defense. During the counteroffensive, the Wehrmacht actively used aircraft, and the soldiers of the Red Army looked at the sky with alarm. Wehrmacht divisions managed to break through the hastily organized defenses of the Red Army and already on March 10 to reach the outskirts of Kharkov, and on March 15 to surround the city. The commander of the defense of Kharkov, Major General Belov, decided to break through to the southeast. By March 17, the defenders of Kharkov managed to break out of the encirclement and take up defense on the banks of the Seversky Donets River. On March 18, the Wehrmacht divisions, having established control over Kharkov, began to move towards Belgorod. Since there was no one to defend the city, the Wehrmacht managed to take Belgorod. After the occupation of Belgorod, the Wehrmacht divisions tried to build on their success by advancing on Kursk, but were stopped by the 21 Army hastily transferred from the reserve under the command of General Chistyakov. The counteroffensive of the Wehrmacht ran out of steam, but the Red Army did not have the strength to try to regain the lost territories again. A temporary lull formed at the front, as both sides were engaged in the accumulation of forces and the planning of new military operations. Despite the successful counteroffensive, the Wehrmacht command was well aware that the initiative remained on the side of the Red Army. In order to return the strategic initiative to the Wehrmacht, it was necessary to inflict a decisive defeat on the Red Army during the upcoming summer campaign. As a result of the offensive of the Red Army and the subsequent counteroffensive of the Wehrmacht, the Kursk ledge was formed 200 kilometers wide and 150 kilometers deep. This ledge allowed the Red Army to launch an offensive on Kharkov and try to surround the Wehrmacht divisions located in the vicinity of the city. It should be mentioned that the formed configuration of the front was also quite beneficial for the Wehrmacht, since control over the cities of Orel and Belgorod made it possible to deliver a simultaneous strike from the north and south and thereby encircle the Red Army grouping in the vicinity of Kursk. The Soviet command planned an offensive during the summer campaign in order to establish control over Orel, Belgorod and Kharkov. In turn, the German command expected to take revenge for the defeat at Stalingrad during the summer campaign. Field Marshal Manstein offered to go on the defensive and repulse the offensive of the Red Army to conduct its own counteroffensive. Hitler rejected this plan because, for political reasons, he was afraid to switch to defensive tactics. Therefore, on March 10, Manstein presented a new plan, which called for a rapid offensive immediately after the end of the spring thaw and cutting off the Kursk salient. This plan was approved by Hitler, but, unfortunately, for the German command, it almost immediately became known to the Soviet command. Having learned about the enemy's plans, Zhukov sent a report to the headquarters of the Supreme High Command with a proposal to postpone the offensive of the Red Army, wait for the enemy's offensive and, when it runs out of steam, launch a counterattack. In the end, Zhukov's plan was approved, and the Red Army began to build defense lines on the Kursk salient. When planning Operation Citadel, the German command expected to gain an advantage over the Red Army due to the use of new tanks Tiger and Panther, which in many respects surpassed their Soviet counterparts. However, opinions in the German General Staff were divided due to serious doubts about the success of Operation Citadel, but despite the contradictions, Hitler ordered the offensive to be launched. By the time Operation Citadel began, the Wehrmacht had 900,000 soldiers, 2,733 tanks and 2,050 aircraft at its disposal, while the Red Army had 1,336,000 soldiers, 3,444 tanks and 2,172 aircraft at its disposal. On July 5, 1943, at 6 o'clock in the morning, German aviation and artillery dealt a massive blow to the defensive lines of the Red Army on the Kursk Bulge, after which the Wehrmacht divisions went on the offensive. On the northern flank, the Wehrmacht divisions under the command of General Model went on the offensive. When trying to break through the first line of defense of the Red Army, the German divisions were attacked by Soviet tanks. The counterattack involved T-34 tanks, which collided with German heavy Tiger tanks. As a result of a 3-hour battle, the tanks of the Red Army, having suffered serious losses, were forced to retreat. And the divisions of the Wehrmacht were able to break through the first line of defense and continue to move forward. During the first day of the offensive, Model's divisions managed to penetrate 10 kilometers into the defense of the Red Army, but soon they reached the second line of defense near the villages of Panayrai and Alkavatka. The commander of the Central Front, Rokossovsky, hastily sent the available reserves to the villages of Panayrai and Alkavatka in order to prevent a breakthrough of the second line of defense. At the same time, Model sent all available forces to capture these villages, narrowing the offensive front from 45 to 15 kilometers. Fierce battles ensued. The village of Panayrai changed hands several times, but on July 10, having lost 70% of the tanks of the Wehrmacht division, they were forced to abandon offensive operations and go on the defensive. On the southern flank, the Wehrmacht divisions also launched an offensive on July 5, but from the very beginning, the German army had problems. The fact is that the Soviet command knew the exact time of the start of the German offensive on this sector of the front, therefore, shortly before the appointed time, they carried out counter-barrage preparations by unleashing a hail of shells on the enemy divisions prepared for the offensive. The massive artillery shelling undermined the morale of the Wehrmacht divisions, but despite this they launched an offensive towards the city of Oboyan. Already on July 6, the advancing German divisions were counterattacked by the forces of the 2nd and 3rd Tank Corps. The counterattacks of the Red Army could not overturn the enemy, as they were repulsed by the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Fierce battles ensued in the Oboyan direction. On July 7, the 2nd and 5th Panzer Corps of the Red Army again attacked the advancing enemy. This counterattack also did not allow the enemy to be thrown back, but forced him to abandon further movement towards Oboyan and direct the main blow to Prokhorovka, since the German command decided that by advancing in this direction it would be easier to repel the counterattacks of the Tank Corps of the Red Army. On July 11, Wehrmacht divisions under the command of Hauser reached the outskirts of Prokhorovka and began preparations to capture the village. On the morning of July 12, the positions of the Wehrmacht divisions were attacked by the 5th Guards Tank Army under the command of Rotmistrov. One of the largest tank battles of the war began. The numerical advantage was on the side of the Red Army, so by 14 o'clock in the afternoon it began to push the enemy and by evening was able to push him back 10 kilometers from Prokhorovka. Also on July 12, on the northern flank, the Red Army launched a counterattack, planning to go behind Model's divisions. To repel the onslaught of the Red Army, Model had to bring into battle the 12th, 18th and 20th Tank Divisions, which were in reserve for the development of the offensive on Kursk. The southern flank of the enemy continued to attempt an offensive, but on July 15, having exhausted its reserves, it was forced to go on the defensive. On July 17, 1943, the Red Army received an order to go on the offensive. The attacks of the Red Army turned out to be quite effective, thanks to which, on July 23, the Wehrmacht divisions were thrown back to the positions they had occupied before the start of Operation Citadel. To avoid encirclement, on July 26, the Wehrmacht forces began to leave the Oral bridgehead in order to take up positions east of Bryansk. At this time, the Red Army continued its offensive, and on August 5 it managed to establish control over the city of Oral, completely eliminating the Oral bridgehead. Meanwhile, on August 3, the Red Army launched an offensive Operation Rumiantsev in the Belgorod-Kharkov direction. The losses suffered by the Wehrmacht due to the failure of Operation Citadel did not allow it to put up serious resistance to the Red Army, and in order to avoid encirclement and destruction, the German divisions were forced to hastily retreat. On August 5, the Red Army managed to establish control over Belgorod and continue the offensive. To slow down the advance of the Red Army, the Wehrmacht organized counterattacks that did not bring the desired result. On August 23, divisions of the Red Army liberated Kharkov. This ended the Battle of Kursk, and the strategic initiative finally passed into the hands of the Red Army. The losses suffered by the Wehrmacht during Operation Citadel, as well as the subsequent offensive of the Red Army, deprived him of the opportunity to conduct major offensive operations and forced him to go on the defensive.